Tosca API testing. Tosca automation. Real-time scenario-based Tosca API testing. Interview questions and answers. Part 1. Scenario 1. Your team needs to validate an API response that contains dynamic values, example, session IDs, timestamps. How would you handle this in Tosca? Answer. I would use response body verification in the API test case. For dynamic values, I wouldn't hardcode. Instead, I'd use regular expressions or wildcards, regex, or asterisk in Tosca to validate only the static part of the response. If required later, I'd store the dynamic value in a Tosca buffer and use it in subsequent requests. Scenario 2. You need to test an API that requires an OAuth 2.0 token for authentication. How would you implement this in Tosca? Answer. First, I'd create a separate API test step to call the authentication endpoint and fetch the token. I'd store the token in a Tosca buffer using xmatch or response-attribute-buffer. Then, in the actual API request header, I'd insert authorization, bearer API access token, so that the token is dynamically picked up. Scenario 3. You are testing an API workflow where you must first create a user, then retrieve the user details, and finally delete the user. How would you design this in Tosca? Answer. I'd create a chain test case in Tosca. 1. Post request create user, capture user ID in buffer. 2. Get request use user ID buffer in endpoint, example, user API user ID, to retrieve details. 3. Delete request use same user ID buffer to delete the user. This ensures reusability and dynamic chaining across requests. Scenario 4. If an API response takes longer than expected, how would you handle timeouts in Tosca? Answer. Tosca allows configuration of timeouts at API module level. I would set timeout, MS, property in the API test step to a higher value depending on SLA. Alternatively, I can add wait on conditions, example, polling mechanism using loops, until the expected response is received. Scenario 5. How would you validate a JSON response that contains nested objects or arrays in Tosca? Answer. Tosca API scan allows me to map JSON response structure into verification nodes. I'd select specific attributes, the arrays to verify. For deeply nested structures, I'd navigate to child elements and add them in the verification tab. For dynamic arrays, I'd use all occurrences option or verify only specific index values. Scenario 6. You are testing an API where request body is very large and frequently changes. How would you manage this in Tosca? Answer. Instead of hardcoding JSON XML body in test step, I'd use request payload from file option. I can keep the payload in an external JSON XML file and parameterize the values using B buffers. This makes it reusable and easy to maintain across environments. Scenario 7. How do you handle chaining API testing with database validation in Tosca? Answer. After API response validation, I'd use Tosca DB module to query the database. For example, after post a create user, I'd capture user ID from response and pass it to a DB query module to validate if user is created correctly. This ensures end-to-end validation. Scenario 8. If the API endpoint changes from dev to QA environment, how would you avoid hardcoding URLs in Tosca? Answer. I'd use Tosca environments feature. Define base URL as an environment parameter. In API test step, use the env base URL so that when switching environments, only the environment config changes, not the test logic. Scenario 9. You are asked to run the same API test with multiple sets of input data, example, login credentials. How would you achieve this in Tosca? Answer: I'd use test case design, TCD, with test sheets. Define different data combinations, username, password. Link the API request body or headers to the test case design parameters. Tosca will automatically generate multiple test instances with different data. Scenario 10. How would you integrate Tosca API tests into CI, a CD pipeline, Jenkins, or Azure DevOps? Answer: I'd convert API test cases into execution lists in Tosca. Trigger them using Tosca CI, a CD command line execution, tstrun.exe, or Tosca distributed execution, DEX. The execution results, XML or JSON, can be published back into Jenkins or Azure pipeline. Thanks for watching. Hit the like button if you learned something new today, and subscribe for more hands-on Tosca API testing content. Keep learning, keep growing.